I think economics is a very interesting, thing. I guess I'm going to study it for the rest of my life. Uh, the way I approach and teach economics is a little bit different, I think, from how a lot of people approach and teach economics. So if at any time you have a question or you want to ask something, please ask. The lecture is designed to be slightly more, I can't see the chat, unfortunately. Give me 1 second to find it. The lecture is designed to be a little bit, I wouldn't say over the top, but I would say a little bit at a higher level than I think most debaters are used to or familiar with. I will do my best to make all concepts seem sort of simple and understandable. But I think that I just want you all to know that if you have questions or if you don't understand something and you want to ask something in the chat, you 100% should. I will jump around a lot, and we're not going to cover all the material that I think is interesting for a debate. But primarily, what we're going to focus on is the sort of stuff that will come up in debate rounds. So let's start, there's this motion. This House believes that developing countries should never commit to having their sovereign debt disputes settled by courts in foreign countries. If you don't understand what that means, don't be alarmed. There are lots of college debaters that have no understanding of how to debate this. And you might ask yourself, I won't debate motions that hard. And you're probably right most of the time. But there are plenty of motions, even at a school's level, where they approach this sort of difficulty. So from 2013, we had this House supports sovereign debt default as a legitimate economic strategy for countries. 2015 had more debt motions. 2016 had a PDO, so it was an impromptu round that was about economic crises, governments should withhold information. And then round 7 of WSDC 2021 and 2023, which were both prepared motions, were about, economic sort of like this sort of high level economic stuff. So you might get motions that are complicated even at a school's level. You might get them that are, prepared. You might get impromptu motions. The goal really is, in all of these rounds, there are like the base level of economic arguments that you can make, and then there are a higher level of economic arguments that you can make. And my goal is to get you familiar with the base level and hopefully, more interested in what the higher level sort of stuff looks like. But what I want to start off with is just explaining that economics can seem very complex, and it is very complex, and it is very jargony. But if you want to be successful at debating economics at both a, low level and a very high level of competition, like we're talking, WUDC semis or WSDC finals, stuff like that, what you really need to be good at is reducing economics to just very simple interactions between two people. So when a company sells a product, when someone borrows, when you have a bond, all of these things just boil down to transactions between two people. And I think this is true pretty much all the time. I think any argument you're ever going to make is very rarely an argument that cannot be distilled into a really simple example. And I mean this even in terms of complex things like the 2008 financial crisis. I'm going to explain to you how you can distill it into sort of very simple things that happened rather than some like absurdly complex mechanisms about like what banks did and subprime lending and stuff like that. I'm going to explain to you how it happened in simple terms. The most important principle in economics, in my view, is interests. So this, my friend Shania wants to borrow $100 from me and promises to pay me back $105 by next Monday. That 5% that I get in return for lending Shania money is the interest rate. Now, I want this lecture to be as interactive as possible. So what components, go into making that interest rate? If you guys want to answer in the chat or raise your hands, let me know. But yeah, like the free for all, like what do you think about when you're giving money to a friend or when you're, getting money from a friend? Yeah, principal, starting amount. I mean, yeah. Profits, sure. Yeah, Abira. Collateral. That's yeah, Abira.
Well, like when I talk about interest rate, I feel that it's just the added money, a percentage of the initial principal that you get when the money is returned from the lender, sorry, the borrower to the lender.
Exactly. But what, like, how do you set that interest rate?
It's a percentage. Basically, all the banks use 12.5% as the average interest rate of the principal amount. And
Yeah, I
that's just
mean,
to the
yeah,
principal amount. And yeah.
we don't want to think about just banks here, you know, like this could be anything from, like, I'm not asking for Vidya, like a mathematical calculation of how you calculate the interest rate. I'm asking, you know, if I ask you for money, what factors do you think about when determining how high or how low that interest rate should be? And so we have some good ones. We have time, we have risk, all those sorts of things are very important. So I'm gonna give three, you know, sort of big, broad ones. Default risk. So someone in the chat said collateral, and that's a really important one because the idea is basically what's the likelihood that you run away with my money? And, you know, if I think you're going to run away with my money, I want a really high interest rate, or I want to like have some form of collateral. So banks, for example, if you want to if you want to buy a house, lots of banks will give you like a mortgage loan. And what that is basically, you know, you loan the amount of money that is required to buy a house from a bank. You pay it back over time. And if you don't pay it back, the bank seizes your house. So that's collateral. And because the bank can seize your house, you know, they can charge a lower interest rate. Time horizon. How long is this going on? Because a big important thing is what else could I be doing with my money? So if the, you know, default rate of interest on a US Treasury bond that I can buy right now is 5%, then I'm not lending you anything for under 5% annually because I could just, you know, get a risk-free thing in return. The last thing is, and this is a more complex, yeah, opportunity cost is an economics term. And what the idea of an opportunity cost basically is what else could I be doing with my money? Could I start a business? Could I lend to someone else? Could I spend it on myself and do like fun things for me? Like, what is my value of money and how much value today am I giving up to get something in, you know, 1 year, 1 week, something like that's time. The last thing is inflation risk, because what is very important is, and you know, as like the last few years have shown, $105 a year from now, or $100 a year from now is not $100 today. There are lots of different factors that go in to what that value of money is. People know or have heard about inflation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, you know, inflation is just like some good worth $1 today is like the price of that in a year's time might be $1.10 or something like that. So that's an important thing to consider when you're making a loan or when you're borrowing something. This like very basic framework applies to every loan, every bond, anything you could ever want. When you think about what the Turkish government does, and you know, they have super high inflation, so they need to set really high interest rates in order to convince anyone to borrow from them, or in order to convince anyone to buy their bonds, because otherwise people are like, the value of a Turkish bond is very low. This is true for, you know, when international institutions bail out countries. This is true for when big banks make loans to other big banks. So this is true for like, you know, if I borrow money from a bank or, you know, if I buy a government bond, like every single high level transaction can basically be reduced to I'm borrowing money from a friend. Is it like, is it safe? What's the money worth in a year's time? And those two things are sort of comprehensive. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yes.
Was there a question? Someone raised their hand, or was that like a thumbs up? Okay. All right. So that's interest. And we'll get back to this a little bit later when we talk a little bit more about, you know, how governments finance things. But I want to skip over some of this and talk about macro in debate. I think that there are four major instances in which macroeconomics enters into debate. Fiscal policy. I think this was rarely so how do governments spend money? Should governments, I think like most of the time people don't think about this. Like when we have motions that are about really big sort of changes, people rarely are like, how much money does this sort of cost? But this isn't always the case. There were a lot of debates between 2018 and 2020 that were about deficit spending, given that interest rates globally were really low and governments could sort of take on lots of debt without worrying too much about interest rates. More recently, I think, there have been a lot of debates about fiscal policy and inflation because a lot of governments, sorry, someone say something? A lot of governments around the world did really big stimulus programs to get out of COVID. Does
So
anyone
what
have
is
like an
deficit?
deficit is just, the gap between how much money a government takes in through taxes or, other forms of revenue generation and spending. So if a government spends $10 trillion a year and only taxes people up to like $7 trillion a year, they're running a $3 trillion deficit. The deficit is a yearly sort of thing, and that adds up to debt. So debt is like the total stock of all the deficits you've had, right? So people are like, oh, the US is $17 trillion in debt or something like that. But the deficit is not $17 trillion. Like each year we run like, $1 trillion or a $300 billion deficit. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, and guys, please keep asking questions either vocally or in the chat. And yeah. So fiscal policy is that sort of thing. The second thing is monetary policy. How do central banks control the flow of money? Again, this, kind of came a little bit more into focus because a lot of countries around the world experienced really high inflation after the pandemic, and central banks had to basically choose whether or not they wanted to raise interest rates or keep them steady. And we'll explain how that sort of works in a little bit. International policy is very important. How do international organizations control the flow of money? And financial markets are very important. How do capital markets control the flow of money? The last thing, which isn't really macro, but is still important, is just like, how do companies work? Like, what do companies care about? And how do workers sort of operate in this market as well? And those things are pretty important. But I think these are sort of the four main use cases where you're going to see like debates a lot of the time and what you consider like quote unquote economics.
What is a capital market?
So think about like a bank or a stock market, basically. So if a company wants to raise money without like, basically what a capital market is this. Do I have it in here? Give me 1 second. I think it's somewhere else. What a capital market is, okay. So you guys all, your parents, maybe you put money in a bank, right?
Yeah,
So where does that money go?
to the bank.
Yeah, what does the bank do with the money?
So it
It
keeps
just
the
keeps
money
it.
and yeah, it keeps the money. You deposit it in the bank.
But the bank can't just keep the money there, right? Because if it did, you wouldn't get an interest rate.
It lends the money, basically.
Yeah, it lends the money. So it'll lend the money to businesses. It'll lend the money to people to make businesses. It'll lend the money to people to buy houses, buy other things, stuff like that. And it'll charge them an interest rate. Now, banks and other financial institutions will also invest in companies, not in terms of lending, but in terms of, like the stock market. What is the stock market? Let's say I want to start a business. And instead of taking out a loan and paying like a 2% interest fee, I'm willing to give up some ownership in my company. That's basically what it is when you buy a stock in Apple or Google. You're buying like a very small percentage of that company. And what that gives you is a right to their profits and stuff like that. So when I own stock in a company, basically the company, I own some percentage of that company's profits, and I might get some percentage of that company's profits. So that is sort of capital markets, because basically what banks exist to do is they exist to take all of your money and lend it out to a bunch of companies and invest it in a bunch of companies, because that's the way like the economic engine really works. Otherwise, what would basically happen is, if I wanted to like just put money in a company, that would be pretty risky for me. But what the bank does is they basically make it so that 100 of us are putting money in 100 companies. So even if one or two of those companies fails, we don't lose all of our money. We lose very, very little percentages of it, because the loss is sort of divided among all of you guys. Meanwhile, if I were to just invest in a company on my own and that company failed, that would be very bad for me, right? Like I'd lose my entire life savings, and that would be pretty bad. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Let's backtrack a little bit. I want to talk very briefly just about very simple economic principles, supply and demand. I apologize if the image is like a little, whatever, but this is what a typical supply and demand curve looks like. Now, I think most of you guys are all like, what year, give or take, like all in high school, but like what year?
Middle to high schoolers, starting from, I guess,
Middle to high schoolers. Amazing.
Grade 10.
So grade 10. Yeah, I don't think I would have seen this until I was in, grade 10 or 11. But basically what this supply and demand curve says is it says how many people, can people see my mouse, by the way? Just a thumbs up will work. I don't know if people can see my mouse.
yes.
Okay, great. Basically what this says is, what is like, this is a price axis. This is a quantity axis. This blue curve is how many people are willing to supply a good at the given price. The red curve is how many people want the good at a given price. And this point at which they intersect is what we call the market clearing price. Basically, how many people are going to buy and sell, and then the market clears. So what does this mean? What does, a supply curve mean? It means that let's pick like cookies or something like that. The blue curve is like how many people are selling, some specific brand of cookies at given prices, right? So the higher the price is, the more people are willing to make cookies. Does that make sense?
Could you
Yes.
repeat the last part? I couldn't hear you.
Sorry, so this blue curve is just like how much quantity will be supplied at a given price. And obviously, as the price rises, more people are willing to come in and make that good, right? Like if you knew that the price of a cookie was $1,000, you would be out there like trying to make all the cookies you could, right? Yes, makes sense?
Yeah.
Right. Meanwhile, if you knew that the price of a cookie was $1,000, you probably wouldn't buy a cookie, right? So demand curve is downward sloping. What that basically means is it means that fewer people are willing to buy cookies at very high prices. So there will be a low quantity demanded. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, when we're thinking about what affects the market clearing price, the important thing to think about isn't really like what affects the price. The important thing to think about is, what affects these curves? Like what makes more people, like not just on a price quantity basis, but how does the demand curve or supply curve shift in some direction? So what are factors that improve supply? Like what makes people willing to supply more at lower prices is basically the way to think about things. One is something like good. So let's say that in order to make cookies, I have to buy eggs and I have to buy flour and I have to buy sugar. If the price of those inputs lowers, then I'm able to make cookies more cheaply. And it's easier for me to make cookies, which means that I can make more cookies at a lower price. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So
Yes.
anything that like,
SO and S1?
oh, that's the O denotes like the initial supply curve and 1 denotes the supply curve after the shift. So if any of these factors sort of happens, it makes it easier to produce goods, right? So if we're going back here, basically what this is saying is this blue line sort of shifts to the right. In other words, it's easier to manufacture more quantity for a lower price, right? Like you can see that. So, this is like, let's say this is $10. And previously at $10 a cookie, I was willing to make 10 cookies. But now, because I have better technology or lower input prices, or maybe regulation is less costly, I'm willing to make 15 cookies for $10. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions about this in the chat? Like, feel free to speak up. I'm going a little bit fast, but like, yeah.
Are there any other conditions which affect quantity?
I mean, yeah, I think quantity is so in a specific sense, quantity is determined by both the supply and the demand curve. We're just focusing right now on, what shifts the curve necessarily, which to be clear doesn't mean the quantity shifts and we'll get through this in a little bit, but let's say both the supply curve shifts this way, but the demand curve maybe shifts that way. Then you might get the same quantity at a higher price or the same quantity at a lower price. And it's unclear. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that doesn't, what matters is just like these things make it easier for people to produce more at lower prices, if that makes sense.
Is it possible for the market clearing rate to never meet, like the demand and the supply to never meet on a graph?
Yeah, it is possible. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's a great question. So very quickly, I want to talk about demand shifters. Demand is a little bit more nebulous because demand is basically based off of your preferences. So one important term to define before we get into demand shifters, that is, you'll see it up there on the slides, is a substitute good versus a complementary good. Can anyone guess what those might be, like a substitute good?
Maybe a cheaper version of the pre-existing good, a substitute good.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be cheaper. Sorry.
A copy maybe from another company which produces, like maybe a competition in the market.
Right.
Based-
So like if I'm being very specific and I'm being like, this is the market for Oreo cookies, then the market for, Biscoff cookie, like the Biscoff cookie is a substitute good. But even more generally, right? You might think ingredient isn't a substitute good. Ingredient's like an input good. Like an egg isn't really a substitute for a cookie. But what might be a substitute for a cookie is brownies or cakes or cupcakes or some other dessert item. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, what might be a complementary good?
Maybe something which is free, which seems free.
Is it like a good that or a product which comes with the product you are buying?
Kind of. It's not that it comes with it, but it's that I would enjoy it with them. No, so Ram, public transport to cars is a good example of a substitute good. Now, for a complement good, what that might be is like milk. Like if I want to buy cookies, maybe I also want to buy milk. Does that make sense to people?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, a complementary good is basically, it's not like a free, it's like the idea is, if I like good one, but I like to enjoy a cookie and a milk together, then those are complementary goods. Laptop and internet, that is a good example. Honestly, that's a great example because those things are, it's very hard to enjoy a laptop unless you have the internet as well. So when more people buy laptops or when more people want laptops, obviously more people will also want internet connection and stuff like that. So let's go back to the cookie milk example. I might enjoy, I'm not gonna eat both a cookie and a brownie, but I will eat both a cookie and drink milk along with it. So a cookie and a brownie are substitute goods, and cookies and milk might be complementary goods. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. What is DO and D1 again?
Again, it's just the initial demand curve and the next demand curve after the shift. So you don't need to worry about that too much. But basically, something that might matter is, let's say the price of milk falls very drastically. So maybe I can consume more milk. That might also that might also make me want to consume more cookies because now it's cheaper for me to consume milk. So I can also consume like my budget in a sense, like the amount of money I have that I'm spending on milk. Even if I want more on milk, might reduce, and that means I can spend more money on cookies as well. And I want to spend more money on cookies. Does that make sense?
Yes, sure.
Great. Now let's say, the price of brownies increases. That might mean that I want to spend, I don't want to spend any money on brownies anymore, and I want to spend more money on cookies. So the demand for cookies will increase because those things trade off. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Great. And the last important one is just, if my income rises, I can spend more on more things. That means the demand for things rises. So that's a very important way to think about demand. Demand is income, the amount of money I can spend on a particular good, especially in a macroeconomic sense. We don't normally think about substitutes or complements that much, but income is really the big thing. Income is, do I have money to buy a house? Do I have money to buy a car? If I have more income, I can buy more things. If I have less income, I can buy fewer things. Make sense?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So basically income is salary, like the salary,
Yeah.
So, okay.
How much money you make or how much money you have. Doesn't have to be salary. Like, you can think of income as, yeah, but it's normally salary.
But sir, isn't
That's a great point,
like
Rob.
a great, like an increased income directly doesn't mean that you're going to buy a certain thing more. It could also mean that you continue to buy it the same amount that you used to with an
Yeah, of
increased
course,
income.
of course, of course. Rom, that's a great point. Rich people buying cars instead of a motorcycle, fantastic point. So you'll see that in parentheses, this is called a normal good. So a normal good, definitionally, is just a good for which, when your income rises, you buy more of it. By definition, that might look like I buy more food, I buy more books. But there are some goods that are what we would call inferior goods. That is, as your income rises, you may buy less of it. Cars versus motorcycle is a good example. But there are other good examples as well. Does anyone know what you guys know instant noodles?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Just making sure, everyone has their own brand of different, instant noodles, Maggi, instant ramen, whatever. But instant noodles are the sort of thing where I consumed a lot of when I was a college student and I wasn't making any money. And yeah, Maggi, I mean, love Maggi. But, and to be fair, I also consumed a lot of that when I was a kid because it is great. But instant noodles, easy mac and cheese, these are the sort of things that, when you're a college student who has no money, you might need a lot of. But you don't eat every day if, you get wealthier and wealthier. Potatoes, for example, were like a classic inferior good in like Ireland in like the 1800s or the 1900s, where basically people would consume them when they didn't have lots of money. And then the richer they got, the less they would need to rely on those sort of staple, very basic goods. They could afford more expensive things. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Is it like
Yes.
cotton and silk? Like as you become richer, you buy less cotton as that's a bad example, but it's like because of the price, let it be.
No. These are all great examples. And to be clear, it's not the case that like a motorcycle or cotton, like if you calculated like what happens when incomes rise, I'm sure people would actually buy more motorcycles. But the point of this example is just to say these are, very clear, like they substitute away from other more like normal goods, right? Like people are going to buy cars if they have tons of money. They're not going to buy motorcycles. People are going to buy like Lamborghinis. They're not going to buy, Honda Civics. And so even though those things aren't maybe strictly inferior, it's good to think about how these are inferior relative to other goods. Great job, guys. So, macroeconomics at an aggregate level, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves, that's what AD and AS stand for, are basically just the sums of all of these industries, all of these markets, right? So like if we go back here, this is the price and quantity for a cookie market. And if we add up all the cookies and we add it all with cars and homes and all this stuff, we get to the economy. Sorry. We get to the economy, which is aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And instead of price and quantity, we call this GDP and price level. So the same sort of things very easily. Let's talk about what happens if there's a rise in income. Let's say everyone's income rises. What happens to this aggregate demand curve?
I think the price level will increase.
Great. So this aggregate demand curve sort of shifts. I can't annotate for some reason, but that's like because I can't find it. But this line will shift to the right, which will make the price level, be somewhere here instead. So that's how we get inflation, right? If a lot of people have higher incomes and demand more goods, the price level rises. Make sense? Great. Let me see what we have. Okay. A big part of, economics is sort of trading off between this real output GDP and wanting to increase that and wanting to not make the price level too high. So government policy, fiscal policy, oftentimes shifts the demand curve. That is, we make it, if we spend lots of money on infrastructure or healthcare, what we're generally doing is we're shifting out the aggregate demand curve. A central bank might, shift things the other way by raising interest rates. What that might do is it might encourage people to spend less. And so it might shift things this way. But it also might affect businesses. It might make it easier for them to do business and maybe shift the aggregate supply curve this way. But a lot of the things that shift the aggregate supply curve, as we talked about earlier, are like, what are the costs of other goods? What are the costs of regulations? That sort of stuff. So governments can affect the aggregate supply curve by, doing deregulation and stuff like that. What I want to focus on is not really the specifics of how these mechanisms operate. I want to go into broad principles. What should the government do? People are familiar with socialism, capitalism, yes, give or take.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, Ram asked a question in the chat, which was, can governments really change prices in a globalized world? I think we saw that the governments did change prices a lot, because what we saw in after 2020 and 2021 was lots of governments did stimulus projects. And basically what that did is that gave people a lot of income, people spent that income, and we had really high inflation across a lot of the developed world. Now, the consequence was that a lot of the central banks then started hiking up interest rates, and that did its job. It brought back down inflation pretty reasonably and pretty quickly, I would say. And so I think governments can, in fact, change prices in a globalized world. We can talk a little later about how, what do you mean by illegal marketing?
So you said something about inflation was when people buy too many goods, but after the COVID-19, I think during the COVID-19, people were in a state of recess and nobody really bought a lot of things. Nobody was going out. The travel industry was down. So how did the inflation occur? Since
Right. So, you're asking a great question that I think economists, have very different answers to. I would say, do I have a COVID slide here? Sorry, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff. Okay. Okay, that's too much monetary policy. So, COVID. Basically what happened during COVID was this. Just like Avira said, people are at home, they don't have money, they're not spending a lot. And then there are lockdowns, right? So you're not actually spending things. You saw really high unemployment and stuff like that. Governments at the end of the COVID crisis, so governments, in order to fix this, basically pumped in lots and lots of money to make sure that even though people didn't have jobs, they still had money. Afterwards, when COVID was sort of ending and lockdowns were sort of lifting, the governments pumped in even more money. They, paid a bunch of companies to hire people. They gave people direct stimulus checks. In the United States, for example, the US government sent everyone like a $2,000 check. So we did that. We we made it really easy for businesses to like borrow and lend and that sort of stuff. So people, as a result, had a lot of money. And there are a few things that caused inflation. One, people just had more money than they did before. If you look at almost any like study about the United States, it will be very clear that people's incomes after the pandemic and even during the pandemic were higher than they were before, because the government was giving so many people so much money that even if they had lost their jobs or even if their wages were lower, the government was giving them a ton of money that went above and beyond what their pre-pandemic income would have been. So that was one thing. That increase in demand and people like buying lots of products, that matters. The second thing is just, people were like, it's transitory, because what people were saying is a lot of the rise in inflation was due to the fact that you couldn't buy goods when you were locked down. And when you had, lockdown being removed, a lot of the things that went up in prices were things that, were related to reopening. So one of the biggest and most salient examples is people started buying tons of used cars right after the pandemic was over, because they could drive again, because they could go out again, because there weren't lockdowns. And so they bought cheap cars. So the price of used cars was skyrocketing like 40, 50%. It was one of the highest items, highest price increase items that people saw that year. Basically because people could travel again and people could do things like that again. So you had a bunch of items that people weren't spending on before: movie tickets, used cars, that sort of stuff. Those all went up in prices. The last thing, and the last reason why prices might have increased, was basically because of supply shocks and supply shifts. So during COVID, or the way that a lot of manufacturing in the world was sort of built, was around this principle called just-in-time manufacturing. And the idea was basically you never had, semiconductor shortage is a great example, but you never had excess inventory, because that's wasteful and that's costly. So if I wanted to sell something at my store in California, the process by which it would get there is, it'd be manufactured in, Texas. It would be using input goods from Taiwan, from Bangladesh, from Mexico. And all of these places would get there at the exact same time. Labor shortage is a good example, but I think, that's not really the right example, because that is a good example in China. And we'll talk about China in a second. But for a lot of countries, basically what happened is the fact that COVID happened disrupted a lot of these supply chain processes. So instead of being able to, things were backed up. You had a bunch of inventory shortages. You had a bunch of semiconductor shortages. China is a really interesting example, because China was super aggressive during COVID. They had their zero COVID policy. And what that meant is that they just kept locking down and locking down and locking down things. So a big consequence is it was very hard to get goods out of China for a while, because there wasn't labor to produce those goods. And so this affected a lot of other countries that were buying goods from China, whether those were input goods or final goods. I mean, think about how many things that you have on your desk or on your table or in your house that are quote unquote made in China. So it was very hard to get a lot of those things out of the country, and that affected a lot of other things worldwide. So what does this sort of look like in the lens of what we were saying before? COVID and higher incomes meant that a bunch of aggregate demand stuff was shifting out like this. That was the first thing, higher incomes. Second, preferences. People weren't spending on things before, and they wanted to spend on things now because they were locked down and they weren't. So a lot of reopening related stuff drove preferences, again, the aggregate demand curve to the right. And then supply shocks. Because it was harder to generate supply in most of the world, this aggregate supply curve went back like this. I found it. Okay. Give me 1 second. So what we have is one shift, higher incomes. We go like this. Then we have another shift because people want to buy more. So we go like this. And then, how do I change color? This aggregate supply curve, because we have a bunch of supply shocks all around the world, goes like that. So this becomes our new price level, which, as you can see, is much higher than the old price level. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Anyone have any questions? I just went through a lot about COVID in 8 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, you should ask.
Um, so basically the labor shortage caused the increase in price and then people buying the goods after the COVID lockdown opened.
Yep, that's exactly it. And again, it's not just like a labor shortage. It's just like, when it's harder to get goods from China or stuff like that, yeah, things rise. What do you mean by are these industries fixed? Like, what do you mean by these industries, Ram? You can send in the chat what you mean. In the meantime, I'm just going to, oh, how do I unannotate this? Great. Oh, yeah. No, these industries aren't fixed, right? So you can think about it as like, think about semiconductors. Semiconductors weren't an industry 50, 60. I mean, semiconductors weren't an industry. So, sorry, Ram asked, are these industries fixed? And I guess what that means is, do these things change? And I think the answer is, yeah, like a lot of things change, right? Like electric cars were not an industry, 30 years ago. Semiconductors weren't an industry 50 to 60 years ago. There are lots of things that are industries now, that are markets now, that weren't before. There are lots of things that used to be industries that maybe aren't as big industries anymore. So I don't know. I'm sure the market for things like whiteboards is maybe less, because we have laptops and stuff now, and that makes things easier. Lots of industries and markets change over time.
Fast
That's
fashion. Fast fashion is on a rise, which wasn't there before.
yeah, fast fashion. A lot of these things change. Okay, I'm gonna skip the socialism stuff, and I'm gonna talk in the last few 10 I don't know how long we have, but I can keep going forever. But I want to talk a little bit about developing countries and economics and finance. These are a lot of jargony terms, and I want to reduce it to you guys very simply. Let's start with the second one, actually, cronyism. Cronyism, a big thought of, sorry, actually, let's start with the first one, which is monetary policy and endogeneity. Does anyone know what endogeneity means? It's not a word I learned until college, but I just want to ask if anyone knows it. Endogenous basically means that the cause of something happening, is not attributable to any external factor. So what does this mean? Exogenous is the opposite. So this is exogenous versus endogenous. Exogenous means something random happens, and that causes something else. Endogenous often means that, the cause is somewhat predetermined. So in economics, when something random happens, when there is a big accident, or some crazy random thing happens. I'm trying to think of a good example. We might say something like that is exogenous. Like we didn't know what the cause of it, or we didn't have a natural disaster. Thank you. That's a perfect example. So let's say I wanted to figure out, the effect of lower supply on prices or something like that, or in some region. What I might do is I might look at a natural disaster and I might say, oh, that restricts supply of, I can't make cookies in this area anymore. How does that affect the price of cookies in some other area? That's a great example of something exogenous. Endogeneity means that the cause is sort of like it's already been influenced. So when I talk about monetary policy, a big problem that developing countries have with monetary policy is basically control over their own monetary policy or economy. What do I mean by this? There are a lot of reasons why developing countries don't have full control over their monetary policy. Big ones are if they are pegged to another currency instead. then it becomes very hard for them to have an independent. We don't need to worry too much about this. We can skip this. But the idea here is basically for a lot of developing countries, it's very hard for them to run their own, or it used to be, less so nowadays, but it used to be very hard for them to run their own central banks sort of independently of what the United States would do, because a lot of them would just use the dollar, and that made them dependent on whatever the United States would do. Cronyism. Does anyone know what cronyism is?
Not really.
The idea with cronyism is, let's say, you and I are friends, and because we're friends, I want to, and I'm like I'm like PM or something like that. Because we're friends, I want to put you in charge of some resources or some industry. Yeah, it's exactly the same as crony capitalism. Or, I mean, it's sort of the same as crony capitalism. With, cronyism can happen in socialism, it can happen in communism, it can happen anywhere, right? So in socialism and communism, let's say the state runs the oil industries. Like you have state-owned oil companies, which you do in a lot of places. Petrobras in Brazil is a good example. Saudi Aramco, all of these places are, state-owned enterprise. I might put my friend in charge of these state-owned enterprises. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Crony capitalism is, in the lens of capitalism, when you have free markets, you will still sort of maybe do it. Yeah, allegedly Adani in India. So, allegedly, the BJP makes it a lot easier for the Adanis, for
Isn't it
Adani Group to operate, right?
nepotism somewhere like nepotism?
Yeah, nepotism is basically exactly cronyism. Or nepotism is just like one form of cronyism, which is based off of family connections, right? But cronyism doesn't have to be based off of family connections. It can be based off of, this guy donated a lot of money to my campaign, so I want to make sure that his company gets lots of contracts or his company gets very low interest rates. Yeah, makes sense?
Yeah, sure.
This is a big way that firms operate in a lot of the world, especially in developing economies. I think there are lots of like very good examples around the world where firms are like company, or like a country is sort of subservient to one family or one company or something like that. South Africa is a really good example. One of the richest families in South Africa were huge supporters of the ANC, the Gupta family, and the ANC rewarded them with lots and lots of contracts and lots of money. There were lots and lots of allegations of, this is bad, this is unethical. Even in the most developed countries, you have tons of cronyism, right? So a big problem in the United States is campaign finance laws and how that allows companies to basically fund candidates and then extract benefits from them in return. Make sense?
Yeah, that's a problem.
Cool. Liquidity constraints. What is liquidity? Liquidity, very simply, is just how much money I have right now. That's generally, or like how much money am I able to get right now? So when you think about the liquidity of an individual, really what we're talking about is like what's in your bank account. Now, there are some things that I might have, for example, that are not exactly liquid asset. Liquidity is like how much money can I easily get tomorrow or in like a month or something like that. So let's say I have money, like I've invested a lot of money in my house or in art or something like that. Those might be more illiquid assets than cash, because cash, I can give that to you tomorrow and that's worth something. Art, it's a little unclear. Like if I give you a really nice painting, maybe you'll accept that, maybe you won't. Maybe that's like, if I bought it for $10 million, maybe I can give it to you tomorrow for like 8 million, but that's liquidity. Countries also have big liquidity constraints. And this is always a big question. Like you have money, what are you going to spend it on? You have money, do you need to borrow more of it to invest in healthcare, to invest in infrastructure? So this is a big determinant of what developing countries are able to do in a way that it binds them more than it binds other countries. The US is one of the few countries that can basically borrow sort of freely. Like it can always borrow money, it can run tons of high deficits because people trust that it will pay off its debts over time. But that's not true for a lot of other countries. Turkey is a very good example where, Argentina is sort of the best example on this, where like they keep defaulting on things, they have no money, so people are very hesitant about lending them more money because they keep going bankrupt. A fourth way that countries interact with finance and financial markets and money is resource markets. What countries are able to get in terms of the oil that they have, the minerals that they have. This is a huge part of how a lot of developing countries make money. Like a lot of them are resource first economies. Can anyone name some examples of an economy that might be this? Yeah, UAE.
So how does liquidity become a constraint? I couldn't understand that really.
Sorry. Basically what it is what I want you to think about is the same way that like, you know, the amount of money I have determines what I can spend it on. I can spend it on food. I can spend it on medicine. I can spend it on education. But, you know, liquidity is a concern because I can only spend it on so many things. Now, I can also borrow money, right? But the problem is, you know, not all countries can freely borrow money. So the point was that liquidity sort of binds some countries in a way that it doesn't bind other countries. Like the United States will never be truly concerned. Like it can always borrow tons and tons of more money. But Turkey can't always borrow tons and tons of more money. Argentina can't borrow tons and tons of more money. So a lot of the times, the money that they have on hand, that is sort of the most important thing when determining how much money to spend on food, how much money to spend on education, how much money to spend on healthcare. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, guys, great examples in the chat. Lots of oil economies all across Africa and the Middle East are very good examples of this. Yeah, tons and tons of economies are, yeah, I mean, like I think there's a big difference between, I think the US is never going to default on a loan. There's a big difference between the debt is very high and the US will not pay off its loan obligations, which is a very different thing. And I just think there's like people fear monger about this sometimes, but I think there's very little chance that the US can't pay back a loan on its due date. That is a very big difference between, you know, Argentina, which routinely defaults on loans. Russia in the 1990s was the first developed economy to default on a loan, like from the IMF. And that was a huge deal, caused a big financial crisis in Asia. Anyway, so resource markets are a big thing. Labor markets. I think basically the two schools of thought on how a developing country gets lots and lots of money and becomes not a developing country anymore or develops are they have access to cheap labor markets and they have access to cheap resource markets. So can anyone give me an example of what it might look like to have like cheap labor markets? Like what does that mean for a country like Bangladesh or Mexico?
Having a lot of labor, which is, you know, not as skilled as you wanted it to be, so it can only do low-paying jobs, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be low-paying jobs. Like, I mean, or it doesn't have to be
I
like,
think
you know,
a
only, but
high
yes.
level of population means like India is the second largest country with the highest population. So yeah, it has a lot of
Yes.
it.
And functionally what it means is like, look, if you want to manufacture something in the England, it'll cost you a ton of money. Like the pay rates will be high and regulations will be absurd. So instead, what a company will do is it wants to make steel. It wants to make aircraft engines. It'll do that in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, in the US, in like Mexico. All of these things sort of, you know, allow companies to offshore things. Exactly, labor export. And oftentimes when we have, you know, free trade regulations, what that looks like is it looks like companies, you know, if I can freely trade between the US and Mexico, then a bunch of companies are going to relocate to Mexico because it's more cheap to produce things there. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
labor markets are a huge comparative. If you think of, so there's this economics term called comparative advantage. Does anyone know what that is?
Can you repeat the question?
There's an economics term called comparative advantage. Does anyone know what that means?
So I feel like it's the if the basically you compare two things. If we take for example manufacturing cost and we see in which country it is lower. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean that's a good way of thinking about it. I think, sorry, Rob, I think you're giving examples of what is like a comparative advantage, but purely in terms of a comparative advantage, like sort of principle, there are two goods and two countries. Let's say that Mexico and the United States, and the two goods are, you know, let's say tech like laptops and food, agriculture. The comparative advantage sort of refers to which country can produce which good at a better rate. Like if I, allocate jobs or if I allocate money, I can produce, 3 laptops or I can produce 1 corn in the United States. But Mexico can produce 3 corns for every 1 laptop. Like it's a lot harder for them to make laptops than it is for them to make corn. It's a lot easier for us to make corn or laptops than it is for us to make corn. So you would say the United States has a comparative advantage in producing,
So basically, all of these pointers are the factors which help us decide in which country has a comparative advantage over another country in producing certain goods.
yeah. And, in producing like the advantage for a lot of, there are lots of different kinds of comparative advantage, but you can think of comparative advantage overall. So you can have product-wise comparative advantages as well. I don't want to dive too like specifically into this. I just want you to think about the general term of comparative advantage as basically being what are the advantages that one country has over another in terms of making either a specific good or in terms of making lots of goods. So you might say the United States might have a comparative advantage over, Mexico in terms of producing service sector output, financial stuff, tech stuff, that sort of stuff. But you might say Mexico has a comparative advantage in producing agriculture. You can also have, so comparative advantage isn't real, like there are absolute advantages, right? Like Mexico might be able to produce just more laptops than the United States can produce, but the United States can produce them at a better rate. And that gives them the comparative advantage. This is a little too complicated. I don't want to dive into this too much because it's a little hard to explain without slides. But the way I will put it is basically cheap labor gives a lot of developing countries a comparative advantage over Western countries in terms of manufacturing. It is easy to manufacture things in Bangladesh and Mexico and Vietnam because it costs so little to hire people there or costs so little to run your factories there. And that gives them a comparative advantage. So I would rather produce, even if I can't produce as many goods as I would produce in the West, I get a much better rate at doing it. It's much cheaper, much more profitable. So I'm more likely to do it. And it's better for everyone because then the goods are cheaper and then they sell them to me and, I get these cheap goods for lots of benefits, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically comparative advantage does not mean that that country is like rich or developed. It just means that it has a better, okay.
Exactly. It's not about the country's like wealth or whatever. It's like, what do you have an advantage in producing, if that makes sense? So, the last things are just like political volatility and economic structure. Economic structure is like, the socialism, communism, capitalism, that sort of stuff that we have. Also, Kamal, how much time do we have left, by the way?
So we can take like 10 to 15 minutes more.
Okay, sounds good. Give me 1 second then.
So the idea is that once we cover these sessions, we can take one motion and go through the argument that the student can, develop by their own through applying
Great.
this framework.
Let's do that.
So can you by any way forward this like slide, these
Yeah, I'll
slides
send it.
to on
I'll-
like WhatsApp or maybe something?
Yes, we will share the recordings. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
no, I just wanted the slides because they have a lot of terms which I want to, search about.
Of course. Yeah, feel free to. So I want to end with, I want to talk about like 5 basic questions that I think are important for debating, and then we could test it out on a motion. I think this is super important. And sorry, to be clear, this is an aggregation of, many slides and workshops about finance, international finance, development, economics and lots of stuff. So this is like a little bit jumbled. I apologize for that. But I think that, whenever I think about development motions, the 5 basic questions I always ask are, what's the best way to industrialize? How do you build up a manufacturing sector? What's the best way to get foreign capital? How do you make sure companies want to invest in you? How do you make sure companies want to buy your bonds? How do you make sure they want to invest in your stock market? How do international loans work is always a great question. And a question that like I think people don't appreciate enough, especially at a young level. Like I didn't really understand anything about international finance until, honestly recently. And I think it's a really complex topic. But I think if you can make arguments at a school, like in schools, about, what a debt crisis looks like, which is also in these slides, but we're not going to talk about it, like how the IMF works, you will be making so much more impactful arguments than any of the other people that you work with. What happens to resources? Do you have them? Do you not have them? And then lastly, the investment in the general population. And what I mean by that is like, are you spending money on education? Are you spending money on healthcare? These are all very important questions that you get and that you should think about when you're debating development. Yeah, there's a lot of like Pakistan, Sri Lanka stuff with the IMF. People were talking a lot recently about Sri Lanka and the IMF, especially given the fuel crisis. Super interesting stuff that I think like, I'll leave to a later date. I want to talk about, let's do one of these motions then. Let's not do that motion. Okay, let's do this second motion. This House believes that developing nations should distribute as a dividend to citizens all income derived from natural resource extraction. I'll give everyone like 2 or 3 minutes to like read that and think about it. And then let's start asking questions about what this means, what this looks like. Let's set in the chat what arguments we think make sense or good examples that we can think of. Just whatever you want to talk about, let's spend the next 15 minutes. Yeah, dividend is income. So dividend is like, the government gives people money. A good example is Saudi Arabia, for example, which like a lot of people have income that's generated off of, yeah.
Are we supposed to make arguments on the proposition side or the opposition side?
Either. I think I just want to talk through the motion. Like we don't have to, there's no really set rules on how we do this. Let's just give arguments that we can think of. So if you can think of a really good argument on op, feel free to say it. If you have a question, if you have a great example that you think of, yeah, anything you want. Yeah, motion 2.
Can I give an argument?
Yeah, let's look at what we see in the chat. So Sai asks, how do you justify the government taking control of income from natural resources? Won't it discourage corporations from stepping in and won't it lead to the economy dipping? I think it's a great question. I think it's sort of like, you can make the op argument that governments shouldn't sort of do this because they shouldn't have control over natural resource extraction. I think the motion might presume that they have the control over natural resource extraction, but maybe not. And I think op could argue that like it's a lot harder to maintain this. So op argument, I mean, this makes sense. I think it does discourage corporations from stepping in, but it's not clear that you need corporations to step in, is the first thing to say. The second thing is it's also like lots of state-owned oil companies do in fact work with foreign partners. So British Petroleum, has like wells in Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Aramco like does a lot of the like they're you can drill anywhere basically. But yeah, it might lead to the economy dipping. A very good argument that people will traditionally make is in this motion here is in this thing called Dutch disease, which is basically an interesting explanation of how when you have your economy focused and built off of one source of revenue like oil, then it has effects on other parts of the economy. But that's a great argument, and you can look into the slides for talking about Dutch disease a little bit later.
Can I give my argument for the prop?
I want to go through the ones in the chat and then I'll get back to you. So Ram says opposition, no long-term benefit as people may not save for rainy day. Better to invest as national funds like Norway, the UAE. I think that's fair. I think this is basically an argument that's just like people are worse at allocating money than the government is, which is a good argument to make on a motion like this. Adrian, more incentive to buy stuff by citizens. Yep, totally agree. So you just get more money overall. It's not clear if you get more income for the government because like they're just giving it away. But yeah, Abira, what was your argument?
So basically, natural resources belong to the nation, and it's ethically wrong for the government to profit from that, because in the end, the ministers or the government, especially in developing countries where corruption is like a normal thing, the ministers will be benefiting from that. So giving the people the money will maintain first a higher level of transparency, and second, a lesser chances of corruption, because now the people know where the money is coming and flowing. Because development might not be the chance. They might, instead of putting that money in development, they might use it, the ministers, the government.
Right. Exactly. So it's just like, this is the opposite version of, Ram's argument, which is people are better at using money than the ministers are because the ministers might be corrupt. Ram also has a prop argument, which is more money means more education and a bigger domestic market. That's an interesting, like, that's an interest, like, I agree with the idea of the argument. And I think it's a good way to beat back the resource curse stuff that, we haven't talked about, but is in these slides there. Adrian says less homeless, there's a safety net, less crime, less poverty. Exactly. I think that, basically the question of this motion is twofold, which is one, like, should governments be controlling the natural resource extraction? And then two, are people better at using that money than governments are? Because governments can, make education free with this money, or, make cities nicer or stuff like that, or they can give it directly to the people. And there are lots of good questions about sort of what that looks like. So I think, crony, like, all these things, like that sort of stuff is super important in terms of being like, if people get the money, they can use it, they can spend on things they like, and it doesn't go to corrupt bureaucrats. And the op is exactly, people aren't good at spending this money, they're going to spend it badly, they're going to become reliant on this, and then if there's a shock, it's really bad. Can anyone give examples of sort of, does anyone like have any ideas about, let's say, oil, like what might happen? Like how might this be bad? Like why might this not work?
So could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so, Sangat makes the argument in the chat that's like, people rely on these things, and if the industry slows down or faces loss, people have sort of a financial crisis. Can anyone give any examples of what this might look like?
Can I tell one?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So, for example, if a country relies on a timber and there is a sort of natural disaster, or there's a fungus that spreads through and it destroys all of the the crops, the natural resource, and as a result, the industry slows down. And because the people rely on this for, if not completely, partially, I feel it would still make them go through a difficult time.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
basically,
That's
I
100%.
feel that oil could deplete in countries because oil is a non-renewable resource, and that could cause the income from oil to reduce, and that could subsequently lead to people, failing, just like some kids
Yeah,
say.
I mean, obviously, if a country runs out of that resource, that's like a very, very bad thing. That doesn't always happen, but what does definitely happen is the price of oil changes a lot, right? So Ram says lower oil prices. Great example. Lower oil prices are really, really bad for countries like Russia and Venezuela that are super reliant on oil. And when the oil price gets lower, the government revenues sort of collapse. Yeah, so you get, unemployment, loss of geopolitical cloud, more people in the streets, you can't finance programs, all that sort of stuff is pretty bad. But yeah, great job, guys. So I think this is like, these are the sorts of arguments that you would make on a motion like this. Nice. Good job all around. I'll stay around for, 5 minutes of any last questions. Let me let me
Sir, I had a doubt.
yeah.
So basically, inflation is caused when people buy a lot of things from the market. So during inflation, the demand reduces and the supply also reduces, or does the supply remain the same?
No, so inflation isn't
For
really like,
inflation, and why does inflation just it just keeps on getting larger? It just doesn't reduce anytime soon. So why is that? Because now when the cost is really high and people's money are right, they have demonetized some of the money. So basically, how they gonna, you know,
sorry, I'm not sure I'm following your question.
basically like during an inflation, all the cost of the goods is like extremely high. So people stop buying those goods. But then I have seen that inflation keeps on rising. It doesn't deplete or it doesn't reduce anytime soon. Like in India, it's like
So that's a one, I think we have to be clear about what we mean here. When you say inflation keeps rising, does that mean the price level keeps rising? Because inflation isn't the price level. Inflation is the rate at which the price level increases, right? And so the price level, if the price level goes up by 2%, we would say that's 2% inflation. If the price level goes up by 4%, we'd say that's 4% inflation. So when we say inflation is rising, what that means is, we're going from like 2% to 4% inflation. It's very rare that the price level goes back down, but you might get some things of deflation. When does deflation happen? It happens during recessions. It happens during like financial crises. When people stop demanding goods, the prices decrease. People offer cheaper goods. But prices decreasing is not always the same. Prices decreasing is different from inflation decreasing. Like inflation decreasing might mean that prices increase just at a slower rate. I don't know if people are taking physics or at all, but this is like a very much like a speed versus velocity sort of thing, like a derivative thing, if you are thinking about it. Anyway, so let me start with saying inflation can be like it can just compound. So the 1970s in the US and honestly in a lot of the world was a good example of this, where basically what happened was when prices kept rising and rising and rising, that affected other industries as well. Like other industries, because the prices were rising, they had to hike their own prices. And so you just got a ton of inflation. You were getting like 14, 15% inflation, which was a far cry from like the standard thing that we want to target, which is like 2% inflation. Argentina is a great example where they just keep having inflation and inflation and inflation, like prices keep rising. And a lot of that is due to non-demand things, but like supply and cost things as well. So sometimes when you get inflation, it is really hard to control it, and prices just keep rising forever. That's one thing. Inflation can balance deflation in the sense that I was just talking about. So, prices might rise for some goods and prices might drop for some other goods, and that sort of balances it out. But it's very rare for countries to undergo, you don't want, to be clear, to undergo deflation. Like, that's a very bad thing, I think, most of the time. How much time does the American team spend weekly for WSDC prep? I think during the year, it's about an hour or two per week. And then the closer we get to WSDC, the more we try to step it up. So I think, last year we were practicing maybe 3 hours, 4 hours a week between like May to June. We normally have like a boot camp for about a week in July. And yeah, that's it.
Thanks a lot. Aditya. Is there any question we'll take last minute, 1 minute, then, we'll wrap up.
Feel free to, ask any questions. I think it's the first US win. I think that, to be perfectly honest, I think the first thing that went into it is the team was very cohesive. Like, they worked really well together. I think that's something that you get off of practice, something you get off of people putting aside, their egos about wanting to speak in a given position and just being willing to do whatever the coaches say, and being willing to work and improve. It's rare, I think, that you get a team where everyone sort of works together so well. I was very happy that, and it's almost never the case. I've never seen it be the case in world schools for every member of the team to speak in an out round, because, world schools is like a 3-person, it's a 5-person team with 3 people actually speaking. This was the first time I've seen, that we were able to, like, we put like every single person on the team, all 5 of them spoke in an out round. And I think that was super important and super huge. Like, it was very well balanced. I think in terms of the coaching, like, I don't know. I just debated the kids a lot, and over the span of a week, and they got better, because I think just debating more and thinking about how you give speeches is just a really important thing. I truly think that, like, the boot camp is always the thing that's the most helpful to the students. Just like debating, 20 debates over the course of a week is intense, but it works really well. And I think people, really get into it and really are excited and enjoy it. It's hard for me to say like what makes a team, great. Like, I thought last year's team was great. And this year's team obviously is also fantastic. But I've seen like a million teams that are really fantastic from around the world. The one round we lost last year was against India. And those guys are fantastic, and I love the coaches, and I love,
They
all
were
my
the first break team, correct? They break the
Huh?
first.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
broke
the
first. They
first and
broke
third
first.
Yeah, in the
Yeah.
Sir, as a PhD student, do you still debate, or do adults have like debate competitions, or like something?
Technically speaking, so I don't really debate. I've debated once in the past, honestly, like twice in the past 5 years, I would say. 4 years, since like 2021. I always forget what year it is. I debated at the HWS round robin in April. That was, for fun, because they were doing like a open competition, and a lot of people older than me came back. I think I was like in the middle age of the
Yeah.
tournament.
Ashish,
And then,
Harish and all, yeah.
huh?
You're correct. Yeah. There were a lot
Yeah,
of
there were like a lot of old, like Ashish Kumar showed up, which was, fun. Never debated against him. It was fun. Before that, the last time I debated, with this guy Hamza. I'm sure people know him. At the HWS round robin when I was still in college. That was 2022. And then, yeah, I think this was the only tournament I've done when I was outside of college. It's interesting. You'll see like a lot of older people in the UK and Europe do debate when they're in PhDs and stuff like that. Like, a lot of, people at Oxford are doing a PhD, or doing like a second master's and they're on like their third institution, like they debated for Cambridge and LSE, and now they're debating for Oxford. That happens like, kind of frequently, but I don't do that. I don't do
I
that.
know. I guess the this year winners team, one of the member is a PhD student, Mark Anthony.
Yeah, Rothers. Yeah. So when I knew Mark, it was very funny for me to see Mark debating for Oxford because, I stopped doing WDC during the pandemic. So my last Worlds was Thailand Worlds where we semied, and Mark was at Thailand Worlds with Sydney. So it was very funny for me to see him, 4 years later when I was CAing and he was debating, and I was like, come on, Mark, like you should be gone by now. You're too old.
But it pays well for him, correct? Ultimately comebacks and take the trophy. Yeah, so
Yeah. No, it was good. And I love Mark, so it's totally fine. But yeah.
I guess thanks a lot, Aditya. I hope it's a very wonderful session, and obviously covered a lot about economics, and most importantly arose curiosity of our students, correct? And I will you share the link. We will further share the PPT and everything with them. Thanks a lot for coming in. Thanks a lot.
Of course. Take care, everyone. It was a pleasure. Cheers.